The rains have stopped for now, but more than 1/3 of the country has been left underwater. Over 33 million people have been affected. Now, this map shows the vast areas impacted by the floods, stretching across the entire length of the country. And in the south, much of Pakistan's breadbasket provinces have been submerged, raising concerns about food security.
A village underwater in Pakistan's Sindh province, one of several key agricultural regions that now resemble small oceans. Many people here were poor before the floods came. Now they've lost almost everything. In those areas that are dry, makeshift camps house those displaced by the water. And farmers salvage what they can from their fields. Pakistan's climate minister says the flooding is apocalyptic and that her country is bearing the brunt of climate change caused by more developed nations.
Pakistan is less than 1% in the global emissions pie, if you like. We hardly contribute any of emissions to the broader emission blanket that makes for greenhouse gases to turn our climates into a living hell.
In the northern Pakistani city of Lahore, the effects of the floods are being felt in soaring prices for food and other basic goods.
Prices have increased a lot because of the floods. Goods can't be transported from Balochistan. The roads are closed. Our business here has almost slowed to a stop. People can't feed their children, can't pay their rent, can't even pay electricity bills. All prices have doubled.
The floods could not have come at a worse time for Pakistan, where the economy was already in crisis. Now, the government says it needs more than $10 billion to recover from this latest climate catastrophe.
Haroon Janjua is a journalist in Islamabad, and I asked him earlier for more on the situation across Pakistan.
The relentless monsoon season in Pakistan has created massive destruction. More than 1,100 have been died and 33 million houses are affected, and they are in need of help. The flash floods have destructed the infrastructure, washed away roads, bridges and crops, and millions of homes have been destroyed. Pakistanis have lost their livelihoods and are living under the open sky in the temporary camps. Rescue workers still have not reached the far-flung areas in the various parts of the country and are using boats, camels, and other means of transport available to reach the affected people. The situation will deteriorate further as more heavy rains are expected ahead. The government has declared flooding a national emergency.
You mentioned the rescue workers not being able to reach people. Can you tell us what are the Pakistani authorities doing to help people?
Well, the country is struggling to provide relief as the scale of the disaster is much higher amid the economic crisis. The government had not planning and preparedness to cope with this flooding, and Pakistan's climate change minister called it a serious climate catastrophe. This is the most destructive monsoon season in the country's recent history. The United Nations today have issued a flash appeal of $160 million to help Pakistanis cope with the catastrophic floods. The crisis this summer is the latest extreme weather event in Pakistan after an intense heat wave in the southern parts this summer. Pakistan is ranked as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change.
Mm-hmm. Now, even before the floods, Pakistan was in an economic crisis, as you mentioned. Now the government has appealed for $10 billion in international aid. Even with that amount of money, do you feel that Pakistan is able to cope with this situation?
Pakistan has just resumed the IMF program amid the grave economic crisis, and the IMF will release over $1.1 billion to the cash-strapped economy of the South Asian country. The government said that Pakistan needs more than $10 billion to repair and rebuild infrastructure damaged by the monsoon rains. Pakistan's central bank had already flagged the heavy rainfall as a threat to the economic output, and given its devastating impact on the agriculture sector and another crisis, food insecurity is looming in Pakistan.
Journalist Haroon Janjua in Islamabad, thanks so much for that update.
Thank you.
And we can speak now to Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. She's the co-president of the Club of Rome, which is an organisation working to address pressing global issues. Welcome to DW. Should the floods in Pakistan be recognised by world leaders as proof, finally, that more immediate action is needed on climate change?
Absolutely, but I would also say that the droughts across Europe, the heat waves that we've been seeing, the fires burning, I mean, my heart goes out to the Pakistani people. But we've had floods in Germany and also in Belgium last year, where many actually of our experts from the south have been supporting us in trying to address some of these issues. The problem with all of these issues is that it's the world's most vulnerable that suffers the most, whether it is in the countries in the West, where it is often in those populations that are already the most vulnerable within those economies. So it is absolutely clear that this is just one of another indication that we must start to address not only climate change, but poverty and inequality at the same time.
You just presented a new report warning about rising global inequality and its impact on the climate. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yes, this book, which we are here today launching, is called Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. And it very much looks at both the system dynamic modeling that we've been doing with the interrelationships between inequality, poverty, and clearly the climate change that we are seeing. What we're trying to do in that book is bring forward clear recommendations. We've heard from your report here in Pakistan that actually the food crisis is only continuing. Some of the recommendations that we have in this book, for example, of our turnaround around food is to addressing food stability through a food stability board or risk management, addressing also the debt crisis by working with governments to actually reintegrate and shift that debt, in fact, even eliminate in some cases, or having special drawing rights. So what this book actually does is look at the clear interrelationships of the crises, both social and environmental, that we have, and what are some of the solutions that we have today for governments to deal with the current crises and plan for future resilience.
Now, your report does suggest that we can end global extreme poverty and reach net zero emissions by 2050. Is this realistic?
Absolutely. In fact, we show that 2 to 4% annual GDP figures are what we're asking to redistribute. We also very clearly indicate that we have to work with the world's wealthiest and start to place a very clear tax on the wealthiest. The 10% of those revenues really need to shift, and actually 10% of the wealthiest need to ensure that they're only taking 40% of our national incomes. The fact is that we can do this. We already have most of the solutions in the current toolbox, whether it be tripling investments in renewables, ensuring that we move towards energy efficiency measures, moving towards regenerative agriculture and local production for local consumption. So all of those recommendations are in there. Shifting also from growth and GDP economic indicators towards well-being indicators that take into consideration social well-being as well as environmental well-being.
Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, co-president of the Club of Rome. Thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
And we can speak now with Arif Jabbar Khan. He's with the NGO WaterAid and is in the flooded area in Sindh province. Thanks for joining us. Tell us what you've been seeing where you are.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. We actually went to see the people displaced by the floods. And what we saw was actually because of flooding in their areas, people have moved to the embankments. They are living on the banks of the canals and drains that traverse this province and quite a few of our provinces. So people are living there and they are dependent on aid for almost everything because they had to leave without, much of the stuff, without taking much stuff from their homes. So they need, they are looking for a shelter, for food, water, sanitation. We did see some tents be provided by the government in some areas and cooked food being provided by some of the aid agencies. But I think the critical issues are around water and sanitation, because without that, people living in congregated areas, the probability of getting diarrheal diseases and even infectious diseases grows tremendously.
You've listed off all of the things that people need. Clearly, the need is great at the moment, but how do you get to people who are in this kind of situation, and what's the one thing that you can help them with right now?
Well, I think right now people need to survive, and this is they are in their survival mode, because these are very basic human needs that we are talking about. So if they can't even afford that at the moment, I mean, there is nothing else we can think about. Yes, the roads are accessible because there hasn't been rains for a couple of days, but the water is still standing, and this is the southernmost district of Pakistan. So we have the Arabian Sea in front of us, and run of Kutch. So water is going to stay in this area for a long time, and I think that is why the government is asking about funds for not just this phase, but also for the recovery and the rehabilitation phase as well.
Pakistan has been facing an economic crisis for months. Now come the floods. How do you feel about the country's ability to cope with this scale of a disaster?
Well, you see, the thing is, even if it had come in a country which is, better off than Pakistan economically, it won't have been able to cope with such a huge disaster, because it's affecting all the way from the extreme north, right where I'm sitting, in the extreme south, and from East Balochistan to the western parts of Pakistan. So if that many, more than 30 million people being affected, and more than 1,000, any government would not be able to cope with it. And I think that's what the government is struggling with right now.
Arif Jabbar Khan of Water Aid, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.